I promise that I will be covering meta builds aside from my usual theme builds, and the day has come that we will shed light on one of the strongest or the best builds in Shadow of the Erdtree. This build is so disgustingly strong and can literally melt anything in the game in seconds. Yes, you heard that right, anything in the game, even the final boss in the DLC. This build greatly trivializes the DLC, so if you are looking for an easy way to dominate the game, this build is for you. I am the Samurai and I will be covering the Lord of Thorns playstyle, the latest equipment for this build, along with useful gameplay tips and more. And without further ado, let's jump right to it. The Lord of Thorns can delete anything that stands on its way with insanely strong sorcery, which is the Impenetrable Thorns. As I mentioned, using this build trivializes the game like a cakewalk thanks to the godly damage per second and insane maximum bleed procs of this sorcery. One sorcery cast will erase almost anything in the game or even make bosses lose 70% to 80% of their health per cast. Even the hardest fights in the game will be popping like candies, and yes, even the final boss can stop this build. Even though this build is meta, I still made sure that it's on theme since that's how we roll on this channel. The Lord of Thorns has high intelligence and arcane stats with a little bit of fate to cast our key buffs for additional firepower. Build playstyle is out of the way, moving on to the Lord of Thorns stats. Note that I will be standardizing all of my builds around level 200, and it is up to you if you wish to level up this build past around this level. Starting with Vigor first, and I allocated 50 points to Vigor since it is likely that the user will be getting hit while performing the Impenetrable Thorns while in melee range, especially while still adjusting to this sorcery. Having 60 Vigor points can also be a viable option if you think you really need to. But personally, I can go as much as 40 points for this build since enemies can be 1 or 2 shotted anyway if you are already used to its gameplay. Next is mine, and 20 points were allocated to it. The Impenetrable Thorns only requires 15 focus points per cast, and you will only be casting it once or twice in battle if used properly. Even if you spam it, you will still have room for more. Endurance is next, and I've allotted 20 points for Endurance. Fights will usually end quickly, and most of the time, my stamina is only for regular dodges, so 20 to 25 points are the sweet spots for this build. We do not need strength and dexterity for this build, so no points were allocated to it. Next are Intelligence and Arcane, which are going to be the main stats for this build. 64 points were allocated to Intelligence and 80 points were added to Arcane. You can make them even, but I prioritized Bleed, so I went for this route. Next is Fate, and 25 points were allotted to Fate so we can access our key buffs and offensive incantations later on. Stats are out of the way, let's move on to the Lord of Thorns equipment. As usual, all of the items locations will be linked in the description section below, along with a build showcase, so stay tuned for that as well. Starting with the build's main weapon, which is the Maternal Staff. This staff requires 7 strength, 21 intelligence, and arcane to wield it properly, and has both A rating for intelligence and arcane while having a D for strength. Its great scaling overall makes this staff a powerhouse for our main sorcery later on. Moving on to the build's secondary weapons, and I am using the Dragon Communion Seal here for us to access our key buffs for this build. And just in case you want to slot in arcane scaling incantations, you have the option to do so. Next is wielding the Staff of Guilty as an offhand weapon. You don't need to upgrade the staff or use it, it's just there for us to have a passive boost for our Thorn sorcery. You will be using the Maternal Staff to deal the most damage for this build. Weapons are out of the way, let's move on to my suggested spells. I mentioned that I will be accessing buffs when using this build, and the first one on the list is Golden Vow. This buff increases overall damage by 15% and adds 10% damage negation, which is very helpful for this build. Bestial Vitality is next, and this incantation provides health regeneration to circumvent the HP loss per second of this build. The Impenetrable Thorns will cost HP per use, so this incantation is optimal for this build. Of course, the main star of the show is Impenetrable Thorns. Its out of this world damage output, as mentioned, can take out anything in the game thanks to its unique mechanic. Upon casting, each thorn will travel on the ground and hit the target simultaneously, and each of them will ramp up Bloodlust, explaining its lightning speed bleed procs. When all of these things are combined, it will result in a huge sudden big damage that usually 1 or 2 shots bosses most of the time, and it is worth noting that even if the enemy doesn't bleed, you will still dominate over them because of the Impenetrable Thorns raw firepower. Now the next incantations are not required, but I will suggest them to add a flavor or more fantasy to the theme that we are going for. You can use the Mantle of Thorns to cover up your body with thorns, making the build even more badass when casting sorceries. Other sorceries that will match this build are the Briars of Punishment and Briars of Sin. Moving on to the pros and cons of this setup, and I think the positives of this build are pretty obvious. As mentioned, you will be trivializing the game as long as you know how to use this build, but I want to tackle some of the cons that you may encounter while using this build. So before going to cons, I do want to mention that the Impenetrable Thorns has this fast cast time animation, so it is spammable and can still be effective even when not in point blank range. Now for the cons, for us to maximize the build's firepower, we will be using the Lord of Blood's Exaltation Talismans later on. Knowing that this Talisman's attack buff will only take effect once the user is near the target who suffered a bleed proc, we are required to use Impenetrable Thorns at point blank range. With this being said, it is easy for the user to get hit and die because of this build's weak damage negation while casting the thorns, especially if the user is still adjusting to its gameplay. Because of this, I prepared two setups that will cater to both adept and beginner playstyles later on, so both sides can find their ways in this build. Also, the Impenetrable Thorns have this wonky animation which can easily miss the target if the user fails to cast it in the right position and at the right time. The thorns travel on the ground and it has this three-way animation, so if you cast this far from a target, the middle part of the section of the thorns is the only one that will be hitting the target. This is the reason why the user is required to cast this sorcery at point blank range, so all of the thorns will hit the target and get soaked up with its raw damage and bleed procs. On the other hand, I am not saying this skill is a horrible sorcery when casting from a distance. In fact, it is deadly as the user can spam it as mentioned and still deal tons of damage. But before anything else, only 6% of you who watch the channel regularly are subscribed, so help the channel by subscribing today, and it's free anyway, and I will thank you forever. If you can hit that like button as well, it will surely help me a lot. Join our Discord server as we are building an empire where you can find like-minded people who loves the same genre. Comment down below what are the builds you want me to cover next, as more builds coming. Now back into the video. Moving on to Talismans, since we are dealing with bleed procs frequently for this build, I suggest slotting in Lord of Blood's Exaltation. This talisman will provide another 20% attack power boost if blood loss procs near the user, which happens all the time as mentioned. We need faster casting time for the Impenetrable Thorns to deal the most damage possible, so equipping Beloved Stardust is beneficial for this build. However, at the cost of 30% damage absorption. This is one of the reasons why this build is a glass cannon type of build. To circumvent this, I suggest slotting in Dragon Crest Great Shield for the 20% physical damage negation. It will increase your overall survivability, especially when you are not used to the build's playstyle. The last talisman on the list is Graven Man's Talisman, which increases sorcery potency by 8%, making Impenetrable Thorns deal more damage. Now, I mentioned that I do have a separate setup for the experienced users out there, and it is going to be an all-up build by focusing on offensive talismans instead, replacing Dragon's Crest Great Shield with Magic Scorpion Charm. And if the enemy doesn't bleed, replace Lord of Blood's Exaltation with Graven Skull Talisman, as both Graven Mass and Skull stacks for more damage. I highly suggest just using the offensive setup if you know what you are doing, as enemies can easily 1 or 2 shots you when getting hit. You will be dealing less damage if you follow the general setup, but you will still hit hard regardless. I'm using the pure offensive setup in the fights that I'm showing so far. Moving on to Great Runes, and I suggest using Godric's Great Rune for +5 stats across the board. These additional stats can give us more survivability and more damage. Now that our main equipment is out of the way, let's move on to the Lord of Thorns armor set. I'm wearing Alberic's set to match the theme of the build, and also the Alberic hat, clothes, and gloves provides a damage boost to Thorn sorceries except for the leggings. Now if you want to optimize the damage even further, you do have an option to equip Varys White Mask as usual for an additional 10% damage boost when blood loss procs. Also change the leggings for the Rakshas's Greaves for an additional damage. Even though that this setup is stronger, you know how I roll, it's drip over meta. Just want to mention this as you do have this option. Not to mention how horrible this set looks like, so I opted for the Alberic set. Moving on to my Flask of Wonders physique combination. Since this build heavily relies on magic damage, I highly suggest using Magic Shred in Crack tier for an additional 20% magic damage and Opaline Hard tier to have that 15% damage negation. However, if you want to deal the most damage possible, the Blood-Sucking Crack tier is beneficial for this build. You will have more damage multiplier in exchange for health loss per second, and this is the reason why I opted for the Bestial Vitality. However, only use this build if you know what you are doing as mentioned. Now that the stats are out of the way, let's move on to the Lord of Thorns gameplay and optimization tips. The first tip on the list is optimizing your opener. Before or when the battle starts, what I usually do is cast Golden Vow and Bestial Vitality and pop my Fast of Wonders Physique to gain additional buffs. Then I will try my best to deal the best damage possible during this burst opener since all of your buffs are active. You will be dealing tons of damage in the process, and as mentioned, you will be 1 or 2 shotting bosses. The second tip on the list is mastering Impenetrable Thorns usage wisely. Casting this skill at point blank requires mastery, and it is likely that you will die a lot on your first tries. My tip is to master the casting time animation of this sorcery and combine it with your knowledge about bosses' attacks. You will know when to cast the thorns without getting hit in the long run. Also, don't hesitate to cast the thorns when the boss is in the middle of an AoE attack so you can still punish them by dealing damage in the process. The Lord of Thorns is undoubtedly the strongest build currently, and I think there is pretty much high chance that this will be nerfed soon. But that's just my opinion because this build was untouched after the recent nerfing of the perfume bottle builds, but for now it's here to stay. And if you made it this far, I just want to say that I appreciate you. As always, give this video a like as it helped me a lot, and subscribe for more builds soon. Now if you want to shred enemies like butter or you want to master dragon powers, these build videos are for you. Thank you for watching, and I will catch you on the next one.